of this panel is Pradyumna Jairam, who has just recently submitted his PhD on rebuilding the Hindu. We can't hear you, Pradyumna. We can't. The stream is lost, he said. Is it back? Can you hear us again, Pradyumna?
Could you try to unmute yourself and then speak once, just to check that if we are able to hear you, Pradyumna? Are you able to speak?
Hi, Dr. Truschke, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, perfect. So I will now leave it to Pradyumna to start this conversation, because otherwise we might end up in another glitch. So Pradyumna. Can you?
Dr. Truschke, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Perhaps he's not getting the feedback.
Yeah.
He can't hear us, perhaps.
Snehal, maybe if you can just stop the live streaming, then we can just redo the live streaming once we have the recording of the video.
Right. Thank you very much for that introduction. So our conversation today revolves around the rewriting of history, and we have I'll be speaking with Dr. Audrey Truschke about a various array of themes with respect to that. Before we begin with the full length of the conversation, Dr. Truschke, I would just like you to just sort of briefly just talk about your area of specialization, the modules that you teach and convene on history, and some of the new projects which you are currently working on, and from there we can begin our conversation.
Sounds good. Thank you so much to everyone for hosting this and for having me today. So, that's a sort of big set of questions, but let me try to be relatively brief. So my own training and sort of area of specialization concerns early modern India. So my first book concerns the Mughal Empire, specifically Hindu-Muslim interactions therein. A little bit more broadly, I work on the sort of rough period of Indo-Persian rule. My most recent book covers the late 12th century into the early 18th century. And I remain pretty strongly interested in any sort of cross-cultural interactions, debates, negotiations of any sorts between groups that we might now identify as Hindus and Muslims. But generally, at least often in the past, that's not how those groups either self-identified or identified each other. I teach at Rutgers Newark. Rutgers is the state university system, one of the major state university system for the state of New Jersey. And my teaching is much broader than my own research. I teach all 5,000 years, nearly 5,000 years of South Asian history, from the Indus Valley civilization into, most recently, April of 2021. I also teach on the history of Hinduism, as well as the history of Indian Islam at Rutgers. Currently, I'm engaged in sort of two broad research projects. One is that I am writing an overview, sort of single volume history of India or South Asia for Princeton University Press, and that will cover the same period that I teach, the Indus Valley civilization, to the present day. I have a secondary research project going on into Hindu nationalism, specifically in the US-based Indian diaspora, which is a research project that many people are not super happy about. But I have a sort of secondary set of interests in Hindu nationalism and Hindutva ideology, and that has been ongoing for several years. And in more recent months, my interest has turned more specifically to the US on that score, while still including India.
on that, particularly on Hindu nationalism. And I would think that this is not just a post 2014 type of phenomenon where, with the rise of the BJP coming to power and 2019 consolidating it. The writing of history has always been an extremely significant area for the Sangh Parivar and for the broader Hindu nationalist family. And we've sort of seen this in their organization of history, which compartmentalizes history into ancient history, medieval history, and modern history. We have specific terms dedicated to it: the Golden Age and the Age of Darkness. We've seen that in particular this Age of Darkness, the medieval period, is always seen as a very significant area where the Hindu right wishes to incorporate its own idea of history. Just wanted to get sort of your initial inputs as to how do you think. Why do you think, firstly, this period of history is so important in the psyche of the Hindu right? And secondly, what is their objective? How are they trying to incorporate their idea of history, specifically related to the medieval period?
That's a great set of questions. So as I see it, from the beginning, Hindu nationalism or Hindutva ideology, and I do tend to use those as synonyms, from the beginning, it has had a real history problem in that Hindu nationalists tend to base much of their claims about the present and the future of India and the Indian people on the past. But the problem is that their past is nearly entirely imagined, right? It's fabricated. They make it up. And that's fine if you can get people to believe you, if you can dupe them into it. But it's a problem when you have historians who are bound by the ethics of history and who seek to tell a real set of stories, right? And who will not bow to nationalist influences. And I'm one of many historians for whom that is true. In terms of these tropes that you mentioned, a golden age followed by an age of darkness, neither of those are true. There was never a golden age in Indian history. There was never an age of darkness either. History is always much more complicated than that. And I think that for Hindu nationalists, they want this sort of easy storyline that it's frankly cartoonish, right? And it's contours, oh, everything was so great. And then one thing changed and everything became destroyed. I mean, this is a story you would tell like a 6-year-old, right? It's frankly insulting to people's intelligence that they try to sell this to folks. But I think the core reason why they want to do this is that they feel that they need a really strong story as an attempt. And it's a doomed attempt, but it's the best attempt that they've got to justify the unjustifiable, which is their ideology and their present day hatred and the violence and the oppression and the intimidation that they bring to bear on really an increasingly wide array of Indians. Like all fascist or neo-fascist ideologies, the circle of enemies keeps widening, right? There's never an end to that. So Muslims remain the primary enemy for Hindu nationalists, but all other minority groups in India are included in that. And I think something we've seen accelerating in the last couple of years is the demonization of Hindus who do not toe the Hindu nationalist line, right? And eventually they will cannibalize their own, right? That's the end game of this sort of ideology. But fundamentally, what Hindu nationalists advocate and the means by which they want to achieve an ethno-nationalist state, it's unjustifiable. It's against human rights, it's against ethics, it's against all modern values and decency that society holds overall. And so I think that it's, as I said, it's a sort of doomed attempt to try to justify what simply cannot be justified, is to read back things into the past.
Just to sort of get your input on when you say doomed attempt. If we look at the trajectory of the way in which if we should say education is sort of organized in India, it's more of a concurrent responsibility, and like state governments of course have the right to prescribe their own set of history textbooks which students can learn in schools. I just want to get sort of your input on, has this attempt actually found resonance where the BJP has actually been in power? I mean, if we go back to 2002, in the first textbook writing exercise, where the BJP was finally involved in the writing of school history textbooks, do you believe that at that particular point of time and subsequently, this particular attempt at bringing in, as you were talking about, this very, very easy storyline, do you think that it has found resonance within a large chunk of at least the education system?
That's a great question. I don't know that I'm ready to sort of pass an opinion on that overall, but I can say certainly anecdotally, I have seen it have an influence, and I see this in sometimes in students that come through my classroom and the sorts of questions that they ask, the sort of assumptions that they walk into my classroom with, generally without any idea of the politics behind it, right? So it's generally fairly innocent for them. But of course, for the people feeding this to them in an Indian educational environment, it is hardly innocent. I also think that this sort of discourse through both school textbooks and sort of public debate and discussion has had an impact on society as a whole. And I wish that weren't the case. I wish that when extreme right-wing groups kept spouting nonsense over and over again, the rest of us were not affected by it. But it would be hubris to think that. The BJP and the RSS and all of their affiliate groups have changed the nature of the conversation pretty significantly, I would say. And I think that that's pretty unfortunate.
Sorry, yes. And, like, as you're describing, the way in which they've done this, you've, of course, written not just from an academic perspective, but also you write for a much more broader audience. Particularly in newspapers, etc., trying to make history a lot more accessible. And personally speaking, as an early career researcher, I really respect that, because it sort of just reduces the gap between the academic sort of structure and what people are reading on an everyday basis. And that has led you to become a constant target of the Hindu right, in the form of course, social media trolling, threats to you, and among other various things which they indulge in. Why is it that your scholarship attracts so much of their anger? Like, what is it about what you write which makes them so angry, or which makes them so uncomfortable, or makes them so insecure that it leads them to launch these vitriolic attacks against you?
So I would say I sort of have two answers to that. One is I will answer the question, but also my first answer is really that it's not just me, right? And I am merely the most recent in a line of scholars, both Indian and non-Indian, who have been viciously attacked and trolled by the Hindu right over the last 2 decades. And I may be one of the more visible people right now, but that's hardly been true always, right? So, there are some very illustrious scholars that have come before me and have faced this sort of wrath as well. And I think that that's important, because it's not just limited to non-Indians. It's not limited to those of us in the West, right? It really is an attack on scholars and scholarship in a particular way of approaching history. I think it's also, it is in part a reaction to precisely what you name, that I do try to speak to a broader audience, insofar as there is a broader audience willing to listen to what I have to say. Not all scholars do that, and I think that that's fine, as I see it. Speaking to a broader audience, it's part of the historian's mission. Like, history as a discipline, some historians need to speak beyond the ivory tower, beyond the academy. Not everyone has to do that. But I thought that, perhaps I had something to offer in that regard. And, people are free, of course, to judge the fruits of what I've produced, for themselves. Let me give the second answer to that question, which is perhaps sort of why do I seem to be attracting sort of so much attention and so much hatred right now? So I think that there's a couple of different reasons for that. One is that I'm the wrong color. I'm the wrong religion, I'm the wrong nationality, and I am the wrong gender for Hindu nationalists, right? Like, that's like 4 strikes right there. It's only supposed to be 3 strikes and you're out in American baseball. See right there, I'm American. This is a problem, right? I'm supposed to be Indian if I'm talking about South Asian history from their perspective. And so I think that these identity markers are something that is very difficult for Hindu nationalists to sort of get beyond. And this has to do with the nature of Hindutva ideology. Right? I mean, they define being Hindu by a shared culture, by the blood that runs through your veins, right? I mean, this is like classic V.B. Savarkar stuff right here, the godfather of Hindu nationalism. And so for them to I think the Hindu nationalists have a real problem among their many problems. They have a real problem understanding qualifications in the discipline of history, right? Because for historians, the color of your skin doesn't matter. Where you were born does not matter, right? Like being born, whether you were born in Delhi or you were born in Chicago, like I was, that does not indicate your ability to talk about pre-modern South Asia. What matters is your training, right? What languages you read, your qualifications, and ultimately scholars always rest on the strength of our arguments, right? And the evidence therein. And we rely on our colleagues to sort of judge in good faith this, how good our arguments are, and to hopefully tweak them and critique them and make them better. The last thing that I will say on this, to sort of answer the why me question, is just to note that I do stand beyond some of the more typical means that the Indian state and the BJP and the RSS typically use to silence academics, right? They can't take away my job because it's not in India. And they can't go after my family because they're not in India either, right? So to go after me, the main means at their disposal is very public trolling and trying to make my life such a living hell that I will simply step back. Unfortunately, in that regard, they picked their target very poorly because I don't bow to bullies ever.
Yes, and just to sort of your point about wrong religion, wrong nationality, etc. I can testify to the fact that I actually strike all positives in their eyes in that sense, but yet I do not agree with what they say. So you're absolutely right. It's more about whether you agree with them or not is the bigger sort of question with which to pose here. But yeah, I do get what you mean in terms of like how they do that. I think that we had a question and I think Anubandh wanted to ask a question. So Anubandh, can you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, I see also Ritumbara raised her hand before me, so I will let her ask the question and then.
Thanks a lot, Anubandh. Very kind of you. So thanks a lot for the intervention, Audrey, and also Pradyumna. Actually, I wanted to put, Pradyumna, you on the spotlight on the question that you asked Audrey about the rewriting of the history, because I know that you have submitted your PhD on exactly this aspect, right? The rewriting of the history textbook in Rajasthan. And as you said, that being a male, a Hindu, and also from India, perhaps, you do not come as the same checklist as Audrey does. So I want to hear from your experience and what you have learned through the process. Thank you.
Well, that's the thing. You're absolutely right. My own immediate identity would perhaps make me closer to the Hindu, right? In that sense of the type of nation they wish to imagine. The one thing which they do not like about me is that I went to JNU as well, where I did my master's, and all those tropes about the how they label that university, etc., etc. I've sort of seen that over the last few years since the entire controversy began, and a couple of them who were charged with sedition are actually my classmates. So like I know firsthand what the type of venom with which they spread this particular idea of theirs of who can belong and who does not belong, who is a traitor, who's an anti-national. Well, so for me, like it's yeah, of course, like my own sort of experience of this was that teaching in school really sort of opened my eyes to the broader political context of how politicized history is. And when I was in school myself, my history teacher would tell us about these debates which were taking place, in the public sphere. And in school, we're not at that particular time, we're not very concerned about these bigger debates, because our biggest concern is clearing the exam and getting admission in a good college and getting on with our lives. But the more you study the discipline, the more you begin to see how complicated it is. And as Dr. Truschke was talking about, the Hindu right wants to give a very easy storyline to history, to make it sound like a very linear, happy, progressive story. And studying history deeper myself, I had a very, I sort of studied it at undergraduate and postgraduate levels, that I began to see that the nation's history is a lot more complicated than what it's made out to be. And then when you go over to the other side, and then when you actually become a teacher, you have to then navigate these very, very different bridges with respect to how do you teach history to young people, young people who are very curious to learn, but have to be taught in a way in which it's not just accessible, but it's also interesting, and they also learn, of course, at the end of the day. And so when you teach, you have to, of course, refer to textbooks, because that forms the integral part of the curriculum. But then you also have to see, can I make this a lot more? Can I make this a lot more accessible? Can I make this a lot more interesting for the students, to sort of give them an idea of something which they would not necessarily know? And I think that's what really got me into the idea of how our history is told, and how our textbooks are written, especially of history. Because I would sort of just build from what Dr. Truschke was talking about and say that it's actually a bigger project of the Indian nation to have history as a very, very politicized activity. And even, it's not like, the previous governments from the BJP have been so forthright and honest about their telling of Indian history. It's, again, a very restricted idea of history, which they teach as well. So my thing was a lot more historical, grounded in a deeper historical study to understand, where does this process actually begin? And of course, the other question of why this is done. And for the BJP, of course, it is a special type of message, because for the RSS, the history of the nation is very, very crucial in order to cement their particular understanding. And as we go more and more into states, we find that states adopt a lot more regional aspects of history, and they try to tie that with the broader history of the nation, which is what I found in Rajasthan, where there is a great focus on the medieval part of Indian history, and that is why they call it the Age of Darkness. So that's the first thing which they want the students to know, that this period is, the Age of Darkness, and no prizes for guessing who is responsible for this. But at the same time, you also want to give a happy story to say, but there are people who are fighting against it. And in this construction of a very, very simplistic storyline, contradictions of history are forgotten. For example, not all Hindu communities were united, a sort of, a thing which people like to omit in order to satisfy their narrative. So it's a very, very broad type of way in which I sort of also understood how history is told. And the PhD is just an extension of my own experiences of being a student who was very much interested in history, because of the fact that I had teachers who invested a lot more time than they ought to have done. And of course, at university, where you learn history in a completely different manner, where you have to shed your own pretensions of what you think is right and wrong, and what you take for granted, because you will learn uncomfortable things. And the true yardstick for which as to how you learn, and how tolerant you are, depends on depends on what your response is when you come across narratives and stories which you are not necessarily familiar with.
Thank you. May I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Yeah. I have two quick questions. So one is, don't you find it strange that people look to the past, to the history, as a source of pride, something to make up for their inferiority complex, which is real or perceived, or as a revenge, for the past collective humiliation for a particular group or society or nation. And instead of looking at the present or at the future, why do you think the idea of hope is so difficult to associate with the future, and people prefer to drag the history, and go back to the history? So that was the first question. Second is, we know that the history rewriting is something which is was present in Pakistan as well, and rather it started quite earlier than in India. And also in other parts of the world, So do you see any parallels to those experiences and to India? Things which are common, things which are perhaps unique in these experiences?
Okay, Anuban just froze for me, but I think the question was complete. Yeah, shall I go ahead? So okay, do I think it's odd to look to the past as a source of pride? I think it's common. I think we see that across the world and across cultures. I generally have absolutely nothing to say in terms of the kind of narrating of history as a nation building exercise. Like I'm not a nationalist in that sense. But when I see Hindu nationalists do this, I mean, I think what's most striking to me in terms of how they look to the past as this sort of, like, what can we take pride in here, is both that it's disingenuous and also that they just make it up, right? Like they're not actually looking at the Indian past for things that they can take pride in. And this is somewhat of a source, actually, of honestly, of frustration for me, because there is a lot in the Indian past to take pride in. Right? South Asia has an incredibly long history. The Indus Valley Civilization is one of the four civilizations of the ancient world. You have Sanskrit literary culture. You have all kinds of political formations and achievements. You have incredible diversity. There is so much in the Indian past that if one actually wanted to look to that past and take pride in it, honestly, I could make you a list for the next several hours and not run out of things to put on it. So there is a sort of frustration to me there. My sort of honest response to Indians who are yearning for something to take pride in their past is like, you have an embarrassment of riches. All you need to do is do the work and actually learn about real history, right? And you'll find what you're looking for. But I think that for Hindu nationalists, that's not going to happen, because they don't actually want to know about real Indian history. That's why they react so viscerally against historians. What they want is a fabricated history that can then lead into this particular kind of future that they envision, that for them is virtuous and for everybody else is pretty terrifying. In terms of your second question, Anuban, on Pakistan and are there parallels? Certainly. I think that the rewriting of history from a nationalist perspective to justify certain things about the modern nation state, this is a story that we've seen happen over and over again, with variations, of course, across the world. So it's not just Pakistan. We've seen this in other countries, in the United States even. I mean, we have sort of raging textbook wars that have been going on for decades, particularly concerning civil rights and the Civil War and slavery and how all of that is taught here. So I think that in a sense it's not unique, right? And so India is not special, but India is a really big country. It's poised to have a lot of power going forward, and at least up until recently, it's been a pretty well-functioning democracy, right? So there have been some blips here and there, but it's been overwhelmingly a success story. And I think that is part of why there is such a strong reaction and so much interest in talking about this right now, is that we're potentially poised to lose India in terms of a functioning democracy in the coming years, if we haven't already. And it's a pretty big loss, right? Pakistan is not positioned quite the same way.
Thank you. That was great.
Anuban, did you want me to answer that as well, or is that fine?
Yeah, please. It was for both of you.
Yeah, you should definitely answer it.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, it's again like I just like to sort of just firstly deal with the part of Pakistan here. I honestly think that it's we shouldn't be looking to compare how we tell our history with how other nations tell their histories, because I think Dr. Truschke's point about Indian diversity is very, very crucial here, because many other nation states, when they tell their histories, they already have certain homogeneous populations with which they can teach a nationalistic history. And and again, in the teaching of this history, there's a lot of selective remembrance and a lot of forgetting, as every nation does. For me personally, like I do not wish to compare, what we do with what India does vis-a-vis what Pakistan does. They have their own history, and they have their own events, and one can, of course, engage with it and compare it. But I still think that as Indians, we need to sort of come to terms with the fact that we have such a large history to tell young people. which over the last 75 years, we have not been able to do that because we have always relied on a pan-national idea of what Indian history is, whether it is what the Indian National Congress believes, whether it is what the BJP believes. And unfortunately, what has happened is that school students have become victims in this political sort of tug of war taking place. History is always sort of understood as a history of elites, as a history of certain freedom fighters, certain events, and certain sort of developments, etc. And therefore, what happens is we lose nuances, we lose complications, we lose controversies of history, which is what the discipline is all about. And so I feel that, again, there's no harm in using history for nation building. But it's when you take this nation building into the next level, which is, determining who belongs to this nation and who does not belong to this nation, which it then takes a very, very dangerous turn, where even the most subtle of, references of antagonism towards, certain communities can lay down a very dangerous marker of whether they actually have belonged, in Indian history in the past or not. So I think that what needs to be understood is that, yes, as a post-colonial nation, of course, nationalism is a very, very key sort of mobilization, but it needs to be done the right way. And if it's not done the right way in history, we have so many examples with which to fall back on and say, this is what can happen. And I feel that in that sense, political parties across the board have failed in to sort of see this. And of course, in the last few years, we have seen how much more dangerous the Hindu right has become, particularly in its sort of combination of trying to wed nationalism with a particular form of identification with the nation. And so I think that we need to sort of look back at history and say, yes, there's a lot of diversity. There's a lot of potential scope for looking at history and actually being proud of it. But at the same time, you need to also look back upon this history and say, how can we learn from these particular events? And how can we learn from certain problematic aspects, which are still prevalent today? For example, oppressed caste histories are not necessarily that much incorporated into what we learn. Women's histories are slowly coming into mainstream, but still not as much as what they ought to be. Tribal histories, regional histories as well, because again, we have we rely on very North Indian centric ideas of what Indian history is. So the more we sort of learn that these are the problems, the more we can then work on these solutions, and then begin to truly understand that this great nation that we have is full of diverse contradictions, which is what makes the discipline itself so interesting. Which is why we should have more people learning and researching about Indian history to tell its story to a broader population.
Yeah, if I may just add a small thing, maybe there was a confusion because I did not mean to compare how history is told in different countries. I meant about how it is rewritten. So where you go away from the facts, comparison in that sense. Although I find it interesting how history is taught to children, in different countries. Even in European countries, I see that there are differences, and for example, I'm based here in Paris, and I have bought some books for the small children until the 12th standard, how history is taught, and it's very different than what we have in India, and it's very refreshing. I find as an experience. Yeah, thank you.
Anubandha, sorry, thank you a lot for the question. Pradyumna, I will hand it back to you for the next round of the fireside conversation, if you like. Yeah.
Thank you. I was just, Dr. Truschke, I was just, going through, developments taking place, in the US with respect to, what's happening with respect to, campus politics, etc. And I came across, something very interesting. I don't know whether this is, I saw this in one of the newspaper articles, which says that the student assembly at Rutgers, which is where you are, they have the student assembly actually passed a resolution which came up with a scholarly definition of what you call Hindu phobia, which is a term which we, of course, have seen by ideologues who espouse the Hindu right ideology. I just want to sort of, for the benefit of the audience members here, what is this entire debate taking around with respect to what constitutes Hindu phobia in US academia? And is it something which is far far more prevalent than what we actually see?
Thank you for that question. So I would say that there isn't a debate here. There's a sort of small group of people, almost all of them external to Rutgers, that are sort of pushing this particular agenda. And I mean, there's no debate. No one I know is really debating with this. So I heard about this too. I would clarify. So this was something passed by a student group at Rutgers, New Brunswick. So I teach at Rutgers Newark, so this is a separate campus. This is not my campus. And I honestly, I'll be very frank, I know very little about Rutgers New Brunswick undergraduate student life, with the sole exception of the couple of student groups there that are part of the Sangh Parivar. I have zero interest in undergraduate student life in New Brunswick. So I really don't know who this body is. I can tell you this, that we give undergraduate students a great deal of leeway in the United States. They can pass and say whatever they want. It has no bearing whatsoever on official Rutgers policy. So, whatever undergraduates are doing in New Brunswick, like, they should feel free to continue doing that in their own circles. This is not a scholarly definition, by the way. You can call it scholarly, like that's an English word you can apply, but I think that this is much closer to propaganda. And it's really, as a word, I feel very uncomfortable with it. It's a very blatant and open attempt to appropriate Islamophobia, and it's modeled on that. The problem is that this is a sort of version of the plural of anecdote is not data, right? So what makes Islamophobia a phobia is that it is systemic and widespread. Right? It's not that some people occasionally have said mean things to Muslims, or that there is periodic discrimination. It is that it is sort of through and throughout institutions, individuals, and sort of all levels of society. We don't see that vis-a-vis Hindu communities in the United States, which is not to say that there is never discrimination. There most certainly is. It is primarily, most Hindus in the US who speak out on this would identify that discrimination in racial terms rather than in religious terms. So I do feel really uncomfortable with that sort of phrasing. And like I said, it's blatant attempt to distract from something that is much more real and pervasive in our current society.
Well, the reason I asked that was because again, it's that there seems to be this sort of now this new assertion of this word, and people are, as you said, it's not just non-Indian, it's not just Indian scholars who are targeted, it's also Western scholars who are targeted based on this term that they are quote unquote Hindu-phobic. So which is why, and again, as you said, the campuses are very different. But again, this is a term which perhaps is going to be prevalent within the academic circle. So again, it was just to sort of see that how, to what extent is it actually part of the conversation in US academia.
No, I hear you on that. And obviously this has been a term that has sort of been applied to me pretty relentlessly in the last couple of months. And in that sort of sense and usage, it is just another way to word the sort of same old thing, which is that some groups do not like my scholarship. They don't want to hear historical truth. They don't want to know about the vast range of Hindu traditions throughout history. And so they want to silence me, which is a clear infringement on academic freedom, and also blatantly un-American, right? First Amendment protections are very strong especially for those who are positioned in India or in Europe. We have much stronger freedom of speech protections in the United States than anywhere in Europe, and certainly much stronger than anywhere in South Asia as well. So there's an added layer to this that is very distasteful from a sort of a specifically American standpoint of trying to shut down speech just because you don't like it. So I mean, in that sense, it's a very ugly thing. And of course, it's not incidental that this is a term that has been invented and is being promoted by right-wing forces.
Right. I think we have a question which has been put in the Q&A. I won't reveal the name of the people who asked the question, but this is the question which is there. How does one have a conversation with people in India who say the history written by people like Romila Thapar, Brackett, and Audrey, you are a part of that group, is wrong? And how does one counter that?
So first off, thank you so much for that compliment. That I am put in the same category as Professor Topper is a huge compliment to me. I really appreciate that. How do you counter it? So you do and you don't, right? So one is that academics are engaged in a very particular set of questions and way of looking at the past and way of arguing about the past. And personally, I refuse to compromise on that. I'm very happy to talk to non-academics, but I am not happy to engage in sophistry and other sorts of ridiculous nonsense. So you don't have to counter every point that some crazy right-wing nut job comes up with. That's not how serious history proceeds. It is a positivist discipline, not one based on countering every kind of crazy conspiracy theory that comes up. And so I think that at least what I do, my own approach as a scholar, is I keep doing what I'm doing. I keep doing serious research and I keep presenting evidence and making scholarly arguments. And, you know, some of my scholarship is directed at other scholars, others is directed more publicly. But the common thread throughout both is that I try to always show my cards, right? Scholars, we don't hide anything. That's why there's like so many footnotes all the time, right? We like overshare all of our evidence. And ultimately, other people, folks have to judge for themselves, right? And I do think that there are folks that scholars can't reach, right? Like if you really think that you need to be Indian to talk about Indian history, like you probably should have checked out of this fireside chat a long time ago. So, you know, you have to be, for people to listen to scholars, they have to be willing to accept basic academic standards when it comes to history. And not everyone's willing to do that. And, you know, you're free to reject the academic study of history. You just have to be clear that that's what you're doing. Right? What becomes a problem is when people try to say, oh, well, academics don't have a right to talk about history or something like that, right? And that's inappropriate. But I do think that there's still a sort of broad middle ground who's listening. And what I and many other scholars strive to do is to equip that middle ground with the sort of evidence and arguments that they need, along with some measure of the critical thinking skills that they need to assess the evidence for themselves. And I realize that there are limits to that. There's a reason why historians take years to get our PhDs, right? I mean, we have to go through intensive training. This isn't something you just read like, you know, half a book on and you figured it out, okay? But I don't want to sell people short. Not everyone can train to be a historian, you know, just like not everyone can train to be a doctor or an economist. But that doesn't mean that, you know, you can't exercise thought for yourself. And I strive to arm people with both the specifics and the general tools that they need to do that.
Yes, I agree that, you know, that we can't, that I mean, there's only a certain extent to which you can engage with all these type of histories which are sort of presented, and not all of it is history. It is just mythology, or it's just like made up as it sort of goes along. There's another question which we have here. It relates to, you know, what about, you know, your position as someone who is, you know, sitting in the United States as a white female academic, and then where you say where the US is far more advanced in terms of freedom of speech, and, you know, talking about the threat of the right wing. So what is your take on intersectionality in this particular regard, with, you know, how it is and how it is there in the US?
So that's interesting. So I would say at the outset, you know, I mean, to the extent that the idea is that I have a position of power and privilege, that is 100% correct. I do, right? I am a tenured professor at a respected research institution in the United States. I'm an American citizen. I'm white. All of these things are signs of power and privilege. And, you know, it's, in many ways, it's impossible to imagine my specific career trajectory without all of that behind it. And so sort of, you know, what do you do with power and privilege? And in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of many people who strive to be woke on this sort of stuff, you do two things with it. You use it for the greater good, right? And you use it to amplify other voices and to promote views and arguments and causes that you believe in, right? That help make the world a better place, to be very general about it. That's one thing. On the other hand, you fight against the structures that have embedded this in place and that have given people who look like me and who have my citizenship and so on and so forth, that have given me a leg up over people who lack those identity markers, right? And I strive to do both of those things, and I'm always striving to do them better. In terms of intersectionality and sort of, people ask this a lot, kind of how might my identity play into how I view Indian history? And I think it's really complicated. Okay, and I think one thing to keep in mind here is that by and large, the India that I study is long gone, right? The bulk of what I study ends in the early 18th century. And there have been a couple of pretty big historical breaks since then. So am I an outsider to that history? Of course, but so are we all, right? No one is an insider to the Mughal period or something like that, right? How could one be? And at least I read the languages, right? At least I can read Mughal texts in Persian. So, you begin thinking about intersectionality and identity and insider-outsider questions. And I think it gets very complicated very fast. In terms of a kind of a potential for bias, right? That's a big thing that often comes up with folks. All scholars have a potential for bias, right? Like this, and this is like baked into our training, is thinking about what those biases might be and how we overcome them. Because keep in mind, identifying bias is only the first step. It's the overcoming that is key. And often, I mean, the ones that come out most powerfully for me in my own work are things that are pretty widely shared in society, right? So a big one, for example, concerns assumptions about the nature of religion. Right? And that goes back to 18th and 19th century Orientalist thought. That is a pretty strong legacy for Sanskritists. I am a trained Sanskritist, among other things. But that's also a strong legacy for basically everybody who does, sort of the study of history or religions or culture or society, right? Like we all have ideas about religion that were shaped by Orientalist thought based on Protestant assumptions. Even if you've never set foot inside of a Protestant church, even if you don't know what a Protestant is, trust me, your ideas about religion have been shaped by those. You just don't know the intellectual lineage of your ideas. And that, of course, that's how you begin to get out of it, right? Is you learn where these ideas came from and how they were formulated, what they allowed people to see and what they blocked people from seeing. And then for me, you keep going back further in time, okay? And so you ask questions like, okay, before we had a bunch of Orientalists running around, like saying things about, Hinduism, for example, how did the Mughals talk about it? How did Rajputs talk about it? They didn't use Hinduism because the term didn't exist yet, right? And so you start to do the hard labor of digging around in old texts and sources and seeing different ways of formulating identities in the world.
Yeah, I have one last question. A lot of Europeans and Americans, when they go to India, they are often shocked to see how easily Mein Kampf, the book by Hitler, is available, his autobiography, and how visible support for Hitler still exists. My memory is that when I was a student and I learned history at school, Hitler's description came mostly in the context of how when the world was divided by France and England with their colonies, how he came as a dark horse, and then he fought back and he made a name for him. And, it was projected in that sense. Do you think that projection is the reason why we see such a prominent presence of Hitler in today's India? Yeah.
I don't know if I would quite word the causality like that. But yes, I think you're right that there is a very particular interpretation of Hitler in sort of general Indian society and life. And some people see this a bit more innocently, right? That India does not have a history of anti-Semitism going back in time, and the Holocaust is not always taught very well there, and so on and so forth. But there are darker aspects as well, right? I mean, Golwalkar openly admired Hitler, as did many early RSS leaders, including specifically Hitler's treatment of the Jews. Right. And I mean, Golwalkar has that famous quote that this is, I'm going to paraphrase it, but this is a good example for us in India, Hindus, of course, in India, vis-a-vis how to treat our Muslim minority, right? Like we should do to them what Hitler did to the Jews. Like that's a horrific idea. And it's one that, of course, it's not without bite and purchase in India, right? I mean, just in the last 24 hours, we saw a sort of call for genocide and mass violence against Muslims by, a prominent right-wing personality on Twitter who now has her Twitter account banned over it. So, I mean, this is a recurrent idea. And of course, we have a prime minister in India who built his career early on with a case of mass violence against Muslims. So all of this to say, I think that the valorization of Hitler is really problematic.
Yeah, I mean, it's also the manner in which, the extent to which we learn about world history when we are in school. Unfortunately, when it comes to the study of historical tragedies or historical events which have led to large numbers of mass murders of people, unfortunately, the Indian history curriculum is very amnesic. The example, I'll answer the point about Hitler as well. But the thing is that if you can't acknowledge within your own history, what happened during the partition and the genocide which took place of various communities, how can you expect to sort of understand or learn about the world histories as well? Because again, most of the teaching of world histories is shaped by political history, not necessarily by social or cultural histories like this. It's only very recently that oral testimonies have come into the teaching of history to begin to decipher how deadly certain events in history have been, and the partition finally does begin to figure. When it comes to the Holocaust, perhaps not as much as what it should be done, but the other sort of anecdotal sort of experiences that I can sort of describe to you about Hitler is that it's again, of course, the Hindu right has a very has a deep historical connection with Nazism and fascism. But when it comes to Hitler, you'll find that what he represents as a individual personality. For example, power being concentrated in the hands of one man. Words like efficiency. Words like growth. These type of things resonate with people to considerable extents, which means to say that these represent very simplistic solutions to currently existing problems. And so you do hear this like in particularly how history when it comes to social media, things you'll have handles which says India needs a Hitler, or India needs a Hitler-like type of government or a Hitler-like system to sort of come into play to cleanse the system, etc. So it manifests itself in very, very different ways. Not in the case of the Hindu right, it's valorization for the ideology. In the case of people who have a connection with which would be like it's a homogeneous ideology which gives us a definitive idea of who we want, of what we are, and what we want to accomplish. Yes, but the selling of the books is something which is I cannot necessarily answer why we have so many books of Mein Kampf being circulated in public.
Can I just have a follow-up comment? Because something you say made me think of this, that this idea of efficiency, and I think that is really there, right? So the idea of, you're sort of like, middle-class Indian businessmen kind of idolizing Hitler in that sense. I would just point out that is, of course, false, right? So, I mean, there's this classic phrase like, oh, Hitler made the trains run on time. At least in Mussolini's Italy, the trains ran on time. And that's actually not true. They were not efficient governments. They were not good at governance. And we are, of course, seeing this play out in India right now at at the expense of Indians and with horrific human suffering, right? That the BJP is unable to be efficient and to control the COVID-19 pandemic. They appear to be unable to even distribute international aid when it is flown and dropped at their doorstep.
Yeah, I just have one last line. Is it also because what he did to Jews was put into context and not in the history books, as the war history was glorified?
I'm sorry, that question cut out for me. Do you want to try it again?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to give a comment saying that maybe is it also because in the history books in India, the aspect regarding what Hitler did to Jews was not elaborated correctly or in the right context. And what was most traced was the talk about the war, perhaps is that also a reason why we have such a different interpretation of his legacy?
I mean, maybe I'll defer to Pradyumna on that point. But I will say that I don't think we should let people off the hook so easily, right? Holocaust was a pretty big event. I think most people in the world know a little something about it, and it's a choice to look the other way, a very dark one.
So on a sort of like a related note, and also coming from the question on intersectionality, which was earlier posed in here, I have a question to both of you, actually, because Pradyumna, you studied the regional history in Rajasthan, and Audrey, you have studied history of a country which you don't belong to. So I have a question that has not history or historical narrative always been written in a fashion to put out one side of the history, because we do not really hear much about also the Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the modern history textbooks of the world around, perhaps, and there is a lot of narrative in the Western history also about the slavery or the colonialism, which we do not hear in the West, right? So has it always not been just a struggle of narrative and to claim the past narrative, ignoring what the actual historical facts were? So over to both of you.
So I would say a couple of things in response to that. One is that nationalism and the nation state model is really new in world history. So no, it hasn't always been like this, right? Like, if you look at known human history, which goes back roughly 5,000 years, like we're the outliers. Most of that time was a world of, sort of small scale village stuff going on and punctuated by periodic large scale empires. Okay. And imperial identity worked very differently. So I concur that one does see this as a tendency among nation states, but that's all really new, right? And in that sense, you say that I study the history of a country to which I do not belong. That's only true for 70 plus years, right? Before 1947, there is no nation of India whatsoever, right? So the nation of India does not get to claim all the history before. That's not quite how it works. The last thing I would say is that sort of, degrees matter and pushback matters here, right? So, just because they do it over the border in Pakistan doesn't mean it's like a great idea to continue down this road in India. And I think that, we've discussed some of the real harms to a very strongly nationalist bent of history.
In that context itself, Audrey, let me reframe the question a little bit for you, because what I really want you to get at is the point where we talk about history as a fact and rather than a nation building exercise. And I want your comments on that, because so far, even from the Western perspective, we have actually seen, war history being taught in the school in the Western society of France, of Netherlands, but colonialism, not so much, right? So this is basically where my query to you lies, that do you not see it also in the Western perspective? Like, we know we have been pushing back at the Hindutva history building narrative, and that's why this panel as well, to push back that narrative of building a Hindutva history. But should that not also be applied objectively to all the other nations and nation states as well? So.
I mean, there's nothing objective under the sun, but I take your broader point. Sure, it should. I encourage you to take that up with European historians. right? Short of my own heritage being European, I know almost nothing about European history, right? I mean, other than colonialism and insofar as it impacts South Asia.
This lack of engagement with colonialism in the West and lack of engagement with certain controversial aspects of the past has to do with how nations imagine their histories. And unfortunately, what we can see is that it is more of a unwillingness to interrogate the more controversial aspects of your past, because there comes a time when you cannot blame anyone else for what has happened in your nation or within your territory, but you have to sort of take responsibility for what you have done. Which is why the United Kingdom's engagement with slavery, for example, is not what it should be, considering the vast populations of the UK which have helped shape the modern UK as what it is. But that is not something which is acknowledged. The same thing comes with other European countries' engagements with colonialism, with the French being in Algeria or Belgium being in Congo, and the same thing happens with India as well, with our unwillingness to interrogate the partition of India. I would even go so far as to say that our unwillingness to engage with contemporary Indian history. When I say contemporary, I mean post 1947 history. For example, the way in which the Indian nation was formed, the linguistic reorganization of the states, the large-scale human rights violations in Jammu and Kashmir and Punjab and the Northeast, which led to various insurgencies there, and of course, more recently, the pogroms which have taken place in the 21st century. It's nations' unwillingness to engage with this because they do not know how to present this, because they are now in a situation where they cannot rely on blaming anyone else for these particular problems. And that is the hallmark of a nation's mature approach to history. And I think that it needs to be said that rather than wait for broad curricular changes to take place, which we may or may not see happening, it would depend on how individuals use, as Dr. Truschke, and the very important question which was pointed out about intersectionality, is that how people who are in positions of teaching not necessarily become spokespersons of other people's histories, but rather at least bring it to light, so that then there is at least a conversation which happens with respect to the fact that, yes, this is not one singular history. There are multiple histories to be undertaken for study here. And I think that it's a responsibility of nations, of course, to come to terms with their past, but it needs to be built up as well from people within the academic fraternity who are well versed with this particular idea of history.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Audrey.
Sorry, I just, do we have time for one final question or?
Yes, I was about to say that if there's one more final question, then we can take that, and then
so we have two here, and I'll try to merge this into one question for the benefit of both the audience members. I would like both audience members' questions to be taken in. So the first question is, how do we combat the tendency of a singular narrative? The danger of a single story. And the person who raised this question he says that he's from Bengal, and he says that we read history very differently than mainstream history that has been constituted, and now the whole Hindutva revisionist project seems to paper over our subnational histories. So how do we combat this tendency of a singular narrative? And within this particular question is a second sub question, where the questioner wants to know that is Shivaji, the Maratha king, is he being overly glorified or not? So is there a singular narrative on him as well, or is there more nuance when it comes to him? So maybe we can sort of merge this into the fact that how do we combat the tendency of a singular narrative?
So that's a big question. There's never one storyline ever, right? So I mean, when I teach undergraduates about this, sorry, that's background noise. I present this as sort of one of those things that is just an obvious red flag. You should probably stop listening to whoever is saying it. Like anytime that someone is talking about the history of a region as big and as diverse and as populated as India or South Asia, and they start saying singular narrative or grand narrative, without a plural, you should check out, right? Like they have no idea what they're talking about. No real historian is ever going to use that sort of language. There's never a single story. There's always multiple stories. And so you strive to tell all of those stories. And this is part of why the work of history is never complete, right? Because there isn't a best way to narrate the past. There are better and worse ways, but ultimately, as society grows and changes, the questions that we ask about the past will continue to change as well, right? So what Pradyumna was saying about bringing in tribal histories and women's histories and Dalit and caste histories, all of that is something that is of much more recent interest in the last couple of decades. And it's a set of very positive developments that over time is already and will continue, I hope, to diversify the types of stories that we tell about the past. To give just a very quick anecdotal example of some of what this can look like. So one thing that I did that I hadn't never done before, but I did it this year and teaching History of South Asia Part 2, is I actually did the same period of time twice in 2 different lectures, and I told the narrative 2 different ways. So the first time I focused on politics. This was during the Mughal period, and I talked about, Akbar and Shah Jahan and, that sort of thing, building the Taj Mahal. And then the second time I did it and I focused on religious developments and I talked about bhakti and Sufism and things like this. These 2 are, politics and religion have never been fully separate, including now. So there were intersection points, and I'm not, saying we should always, split them up, but it was one way to force my students essentially to see that there is never just one narrative about even a specific set of years, that you can always tell the story in multiple ways, depending on what you focus on. Let me end on the point of glorifying, or really, I would say, not glorifying, right? Of course, Shivaji is over-glorified because he shouldn't be glorified at all, because we should really just stop glorifying figures in Indian history, like all of them, okay? It makes no sense from my perspective, or I think from most historians' perspectives, honestly, to judge figures in the past, right? I sometimes put this the following way. If you want to know whether you like a particular pre-modern figure, just stop at pre-modern. I guarantee you dislike them, okay? Because in pre-modernity, we didn't have ideas about human rights and civil liberties and individual freedoms, right? We are all creations of the modern world. And trust me, I don't want to give any of that up. I like civil rights and I like individual liberties and I like human rights. But there is so much more to know about the past than whether you like it or not. So instead of glorifying and condemning, which inevitably will simply flatten figures in the past, in my opinion, what we should do is strive to understand them. And when I say understand, I don't mean lay them on the proverbial couch, like Freud style, tell me how you're feeling today, Shivaji. I mean, understand in a sort of historical contextual sense. Who was Shivaji? What forces and factors made him who he was? What did he do that is important and changed the nature of history and India and South Asia and culture and whatever it is going forward? How did he self-identify? I guarantee he didn't self-identify as some early figure championing the Hindu Rashtra, because that is completely anachronistic. That makes no sense for Shivaji. So instead, why don't we actually try to figure out who he was? And for that, you need to know quite a bit about Mughal politics, about what's going on in Maharashtra at the time, so on and so forth.
Yeah, if I could just add one final point on glorification. Yeah, I mean, when we sort of create these dichotomies of, hero and villain, we tend to sort of narrow down the perspective of trying to unpack that person even more, and which then leads to problems of, defending your turf and defending your territory, of saying that this is what it is because this person did what was supposed to be done. And I think that, yes, as you were rightfully saying, that we need to sort of unpack these people. And I think that that's been one of the major problems, broadly speaking, of the Indian educational system since India could craft its own independent sort of textbooks and education policy. We've always relied on the idea that there are certain good people and then there are certain bad people who are responsible for certain events of Indian history. And if I could just sort of say a final word here, I think that unfortunately what has happened is that minorities have borne the brunt of this, because there has always been this sort of suspicion of religious minorities, particularly the Muslim community, post-independence, where there has been this dichotomy within the minority, which has been created of a good Muslim and bad Muslim, which even goes back to earlier periods where previous governments have sought to sort of create these sort of dichotomous type of identities to tell students that you can be like this person, but don't be like this person. I think we need to move away from that idea and make it into a much more interrogative sort of understanding of things, notwithstanding the fact that people made important contributions to history, which must be sort of brought in. But for all the good that somebody does, so for example, if somebody did do something great in a battle, there were other things which were committed as well, and which is why the beauty of this is that it shouldn't be about one person, it shouldn't be about personalities, but rather it should be about processes, and it should be about phenomena which were taking place around that time. It's only then that we can move away from these very, very limited understandings of history as unfortunately being mostly about powerful men, which again needs to be worked out through intersectionality and trying to diversify that particular field.
Thanks a lot. I was also on the lookout for the next panel that has to start soon. And I would like to thank both of you for being here today with us for this panel, for this interesting, not a panel, a fireside conversation instead. We did have some glitches in the beginning, so that's why we stopped live telecasting this, but we will do that again after editing the initial bits of the video. And would love to have again both of you on a conversation at some later point. And I'm not sure how much of you know about the EU-India People Summit, but the idea is to basically look at what is happening in India and then also think about, in a more futuristic terms, how to shape the transnational relations of India and its other allies. So thanks a lot once again for being here and being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.